The 1760s and 70s would see a burst in Enlightenment liberal thought. Thinkers, particularly in Scotland, were beginning to explore increasingly radical new ideas. There was a new mood, and a sense that the world could be changing. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris would see an end to the 7 Years' War. Europe had once again found itself in a continent-wide war for the balance of power. However, this time the empires of Europe were spreading across the globe, and so a battle for the power balance of Europe meant global war. The 7 Years' War, along with the wars that found themselves a part of it, would involve Britain, Prussia, France, and Austria, and through coalitions and related conflicts would grow to encompass Portugal, Spain, Saxony, Sweden, and Russia. It was an enormous and costly war. By 1763 and the signing of the treaty, the costs incurred were immense. Britain would gain territory in the treaty, yet its debts were onerous, and its condition quite precarious. As a result, they would extend taxation in their overseas colonies, and that same year restrict westward settlement. The relationship between Britons and those in British colonies was beginning to fray. Amongst those in Britain's North American colonies, some began to feel that their wealth was being extracted in order to pay for the wartime mismanagement of the government in London. Over the 1760s, taxation would increase greatly. From 1764 to 1767, sweeping new taxes would be implemented on the colonists, taxing goods like sugar, glass, lead, paint, paper, tea, as well as requiring revenue stamps on all paper goods, like legal documents, newspapers, and pamphlets. The divide between the London government and the colonists would grow. All the while, there was a philosophical bifurcation between the two. Many of these new Enlightenment ideas were growing in North America. Many came to develop the view that the social contract that existed between Englishmen had broken, that Parliament and the King's ministers were violating their obligations. Amongst the elite of the North American colonies, there was as well involvement in organizations like Masonic lodges, places where the ideas of liberalism were being experimented with, often to extreme levels, and so now dissent was growing, and many were beginning to wonder if perhaps a new social contract should exist between the colonies and the home. There would be a growth in smuggling operations, efforts to avoid the onerous taxation, and more were coming to view the London financial apparatus with great skepticism, seeing what had emerged as a system of perpetual debt and taxation, a system of extraction. All the while, the London government continued its taxation, paid little regard to the interests of the colonists, and more became estranged. Over time, British officials, royal governors, those in the Royal Army and Navy, and those holding official posts, came to be viewed by many of the colonists as alien. There began to be more altercations between the military and officials and the colonists. In 1770, an altercation would break out in Boston, near modern-day State Street. A fight would begin between a 13-year-old wig maker's apprentice and a Royal Army troop and officer. Over time, more would become involved with this altercation. Tensions were running high. Many Bostonians viewed the Royal Army troops as alien, and many of the troops felt threatened. Eventually, an enormous crowd would amass, and the troops would fire into the crowd. From then on, the mood deteriorated rapidly, and many of the colonists came to view themselves as something separate, still Englishmen, though apart from Parliament and the Crown. Much propaganda and depictions portray it as though the American colonists viewed the king as their enemy, though the more common sentiment was that the king was weak and had abdicated his responsibility, allowing unscrupulous ministers to usurp the proper relationship between king and subject. Over the following years, the government in London and the Crown would become increasingly restrictive toward the colonists, and particularly those around Boston. Political organizations would begin to emerge, opposing, protesting, and often becoming violent toward the officials. The most notable of these such organizations would be the Sons of Liberty, who in 1773, in an act of disobedience against the Tea Act, would destroy hundreds of chests of tea aboard an East India Company merchantman, throwing them overboard into the harbor. Civil unrest was growing out of hand, certainly beyond the officials in the colonies to handle it. Back in London, Parliament knew that it needed to take action. In 1774, Parliament would pass a series of acts in response to the Massachusetts colonists. These acts would close the Boston Harbor, allow for trials to be moved to London, reinforce the Quartering Act, allowing for the quartering of troops, all while increasing military presence in the colony, and even revoking the Massachusetts Royal Charter. In Pennsylvania, representatives of the colonies would meet, holding the First Continental Congress. They set out to figure out how to address these developments and all this tension. Some wanted the colonies to band together, to simply leave and become a separate nation, though to others this seemed out of the question. The Continental Congress would appeal to the Parliament, and appeal to the King directly, yet they just couldn't come to a resolution. The situation appeared to be getting worse, and the Massachusetts Provincial Congress would call for local militias to begin preparing for hostilities. In April of 1775, British regulars would set out on a mission to destroy arms and supplies of the Massachusetts militias, and on April 19th, the militias and the army regulars would open fire on each other. Conflict had begun. The army would increase its troop presence in Massachusetts, while Massachusetts militias would begin planning for war. Fighting would continue over the following year, and there was now a race to unify the colonies. Many were still highly resistant to the idea. Some wanted to demonstrate loyalty, to separate themselves off from Massachusetts, while many came to view this as an opportunity, themselves highly dissatisfied by the actions of the government in London. All the while, the new ideas of this era were undergirding everything. Many rallied around the idea of the rights of Englishmen, pointing to the Bill of Rights, the new social contract that had been agreed to almost 90 years prior. On July 4th of 1776, an agreement would be reached, and the Declaration of Independence, as drafted by Thomas Jefferson, would be ratified, with 13 of the British colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America declaring themselves to be their own separate nation. The Declaration of Independence is just an absolute treasure trove. It is a perfect time capsule that encapsulates exactly what the philosophy of this time was. It's like now, or the early 2020s, and you heard someone rattle off systemic something-something-archy with all of the ists and the isms. The sort of thing where now someone goes, oh god, shrieking libs. Well, imagine that for the 18th century. Okay, not quite that. Thomas Jefferson was a whole lot more elegant and sophisticated, but the entire text is really a raw encapsulation of liberal philosophy. The idea of natural rights is present. Look at the line, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Here is the idea that there are rights inherent to all people by birth. The social contractionist view is present. Governments are instituted amongst men. Here's the idea that the social hierarchy of government is socially mediated as an agreement between men, and not as a manifestation of divine order. Popular sovereignty is present. They're just powers from the consent of the governed. This is very much the idea that governments gain their authority because the population consents to it. The right to revolution is inherent in the entire document, and the entire reason that it's being written. But just to look at one clear encapsulation, it states, destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And let's look at the line, all men are created equal. There is a lot that is in that statement. The liberal notion of equality is present. That's just very straightforward. All men are created equal. And there's also an expression of tabula rasa in there, that there's a sameness and equality at birth. So the most foundational document to this new upstart nation was really one long statement saying, we believe entirely in liberalism. We are doing a revolution, and we will be building a new government based entirely on liberalism. A war would rage over the following years. British Army troops would occupy New York in 1976 and 1977, yet American colonist victories in Trenton and Princeton would boost morale for the revolutionary cause. A major turning point would occur in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga, where the substantial victory would be the tipping point, convincing the French to join on the colonial side. Over the following years, the war would expand, with French now entering as a combatant, and later Spain. The British Army's strategy would shift to the south, capturing Charleston, and in 1781, at Yorktown, Virginia, following a 3-week siege of the combined forces of the American colonists and the French, British Army General Charles Cornwallis would surrender. For all functional purposes, the war had ended, and 2 years later, in 1783, a treaty would be signed. Over the following years, the new American government would set out to create itself. This new government had to start from scratch, beginning as an association of separate colonies. They would retain that structure, with the colonies continuing on as separate states, while the new united government would go through different iterations, ultimately converging on the modern federal structure. The American Constitution would be adopted in 1787, with the Bill of Rights amended to it in 1791. The United States of America was now its own nation of nations, and it was to be a massive social experiment, as now not only were liberal ideas growing within it, but its fundamental philosophical operating system was liberalism. The American Revolution was a major expression of English liberalism, yet for the past century, another strand of liberal philosophy had been being developed in parallel: French liberalism. In the 1780s, the French fiscal position was abysmal. Not only had France taken on the financial burdens of the 7 Years' War, but it had now also had to fund supporting the American Revolution. On May 5th of 1789, the French Estates General would convene at Versailles. The Estates General was something rather like a parliament. It was a representative assembly made up of the 3 estates of the French kingdom: the nobility, the clergy, and the commons. An Estates General had not been convened since 1614, yet facing the sheer dire situation of the kingdom's fiscal position, the king had no other option. Tension was quite high, and seeing the massive changes that had occurred in the English world, many representing the commons wanted to impose something like a constitutional monarchy in exchange for their support in dealing with the financial problem. The other estates and the king balked at this, and on June 17th of 1789, representatives of the Third Estate would find themselves locked out of the meeting of the estates. Still, they would choose to meet anyway, convening amongst themselves in a tennis court. This meeting of the Third Estate would agree to form the National Assembly, taking an oath that they would not disband until they had secured a new constitution. By this point, economic conditions in France had deteriorated far enough that there was a revolutionary attitude in the air. On July 14th of 1789, a group of insurgents would storm the medieval fortress, the Bastille, attempting to take over its armory. Unrest would grow. Many of France's elites found themselves outnumbered and began to acquiesce, now fearing violent insurgency. On August 4th of 1789, feudal privileges would be abolished, and only a few weeks later, on August 26th, the National Assembly would pass the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This document shares much in common with the American Declaration of Independence, and indeed took heavy inspiration from it. Yet although they both share a common Lockean core, the Declaration of the Rights of Man has a much more Rousseauian ethos. It clearly espouses a concept of general will, the collective will of the people, stating that law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have a right to take part, personally or through their representatives, in its making. It has a very legal positivist view, stating that liberty consists in being able to do anything that does not harm others, and that these limits can only be determined by law. It has a very clear notion of civic equality, stating that social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good, and that all citizens are equally eligible to all high offices, according to their ability, and without other distinctions than that of their virtues and talents. There's also very clear secularism in the document, stating that no one can be disturbed on account of his opinions, even religious ones, provided that the manifestation of these opinions does not interfere with the established law and order. At this point, France was just steamrolling forward with an entirely new philosophical operating system. Yet, the king still reigned, on paper. In October of 1789, the Women's March on Versailles would force the royal family to flee to Paris. The monarchy was incredibly weak, and it was afraid of the French people. In 1791, a new constitution would create a limited monarchy. King Louis and his family would attempt to flee, but they would be captured. Over the following years, France would enter into a war, and social turmoil would spiral. The monarchy would be formally abolished in 1792, with the First French Republic being established. The king would be executed the next year, in 1793, and now the French had made a move that could not be reversed. The social, philosophical, religious order of old had been beheaded. No matter what they did now, there was no way back. The closest thing to a government that the Revolutionary Republic had would be the Committee of Public Safety, falling under the lawyer Maximilien Robespierre. They would begin a spree of beheadings, as the revolutionaries would begin to turn on each other. First, going after those of the old regime, but over time, turning on those who they would call traitors to the revolution. This is a very common pattern. Revolutionary psychology has a very uniquely powerful way of turning on its own. And so, as the executions ramped up, the years of 1793 and 1794 would experience what would come to be known as the Reign of Terror. There's a very interesting pattern in this that we see repeated throughout history, and particularly in the 20th century. For one, pay attention to just how many of these revolutionary bureaucrats were lawyers. But more than that, the vehicle used to enforce revolutionary fervor, to make sure that everyone would purity spiral and keep one-upping each other, was the Committee for Public Safety. Throughout time, we see that the most effective vehicle for demanding obedience is that which professes that it does what it does for the safety of the people. The 1790s will certainly not be the last time that is the case. The following year, in July of 1794, which in France was the month of Thermidor, Maximilien Robespierre would be overthrown and executed. By this point, liberalism had spiraled into its ultimate conclusion. And this is the dark shadow of liberalism that's been ever present for centuries. It got rid of the old calendar, seeing that as a manifestation of the old social order. And that's because in the quest for blank slate equality and total liberty, eventually one will arrive at the conclusion that everything old must be destroyed, because everything that is old is social order, and anything that is social order not constructed on a system of total equality is repressive. It's the chains that were built by society to bring man out of the state of nature, and yet the only way to exist in a state of total equality is to reconstruct the state of nature. So everything of order, every institution, every tradition, every relationship, they all must be destroyed. We see that in every social movement that is pushed further along liberalism. Eventually it destroys the old traditions. Eventually it destroys the idea that people can be different. Eventually it destroys the family and destroys personal relationships, forcing everyone to clamor to prove that they are more revolutionary than the rest. It's the same now as it was centuries ago. That is the shadow of liberalism. There's something quite unique in Christian philosophy. Throughout history, there have been stories of some wicked sorcerer turning up and cursing a people in place. Throughout history, there have been societies that demand sacrifice. Yet Christianity does something quite different. It views the story of the scapegoat from the point of view of the scapegoat. Instead of being the one in the crowd throwing rocks, it invites you to hear the story of the man at the center of the crowd, the one being attacked. It invites you to hear the story of the innocent who has been falsely accused, the one who is falsely accused of causing all the ills, the scapegoat. This has had a very deep effect on the psychology of Europeans. It has caused them to become extremely sensitive to the idea of victims. There are entire societies that don't have a concept of a victim. Yet in the West, the victim is placed forefront. What if the one who is being marginalized, the one who is being blamed for society's ills, what if that is Jesus? What if that is just a scapegoat, falsely accused? Liberalism does something very interesting with this psychological tendency. If one works from the starting point of equality, and is attuned to the idea of the innocent scapegoat, then it flows that everyone who is being accused, everyone who is on the margins, everyone on the outside, everyone that the crowd has turned on, everyone who loses, everyone who is weaker in the social order, well, that person has moral virtue, and everyone who restricts those people, everyone who throws the metaphorical rocks, those are the bringers of chains, the subverters of equality. Those are the wicked ones. So therefore, everyone who has ever been blamed for ills must actually be the virtuous. Everyone who has benefited in the old order is the guilty. Every order of old, every relationship of old. Those are the tools of sacrifice that mistreat the innocent scapegoated victim. And so those who must seem the worst must be the best. Those who have brought order, prosperity, society, all of those who society viewed and raised up, must be the villain. Eventually you think yourself into the total subversion of all order, the breaking of all chains, the idea that every villain must truly be the victim, and that reigns terror. That is the shadow that liberalism has never been able to outrun. That is the shadow that always dogs it, that haunts every liberal society. That is what happens when liberalism reaches its ultimate conclusions and can go no further. It elevates the wicked and punishes the virtuous. It kills relationships and demands subordination to the state, for the state will bring about the new state of nature. It seeks to break all chains and in the process atomizes everyone. It demands that everyone is equal, and that any expression of greatness must therefore be an effort at subjugating others. It seeks to destroy all distinction, destroy all the beautiful, and in the end, destroy civilization itself. For civilization is the ultimate chain. And we will see as we go forward through time that fighting against this shadow form of the philosophy will play a very prominent role in the 20th century. As the revolutionaries were attempting to destroy the culture, systems, and institutions of old, their ire would be drawn naturally to the church. Two religious movements would rise. One, the cult of the Supreme Being. This movement would be backed by Maximilian Robespierre. It was a sort of liberal deism, taking the liberal revolutionary tenets and viewing them as the supreme divine goods, the moral order as created by the Supreme Being. This religion was attempting to destroy many of the elements of order that had been present within Christianity. This movement, however, would ultimately lose out to its rival, the cult of reason, and particularly after the execution of Robespierre, this rival would become dominant, instantiated as the national religion. As opposed to the sort of vague deism of the cult of the Supreme Being, the cult of reason was pure, unabashed worship of intellect. It was primarily humanistic and anthropocentric, believing that the supreme guiding good was reason, and that humans, the highest moral beings, those capable of using reason, should do so guided by liberty and truth. We see ideas like this present in modern materialist atheism, but something that's very worth looking at is what happens when one elevates intellect to the role of God. There's a reason that the story of Satan's fall describes an individualistic angel guided by worship of his own intellect. Man is capable of a great many evils. The greedy might be a thief, the lustful might be violent, the gluttonous a selfish hoarder, the wrathful may be capable of bringing harm to many. Yet it is he who worships his own intellect, who believes that the truth, as he has come to understand it, guided by the power of his own mind, is the objective, true, moral reality itself. He can justify to himself anything. How much harm can a violent criminal cause? How much harm can the violent madman cause? Certainly these can be destructive figures. Yet he who is so convinced of his own ideas, who worships his own intellect, he can create systems that end the lives of millions. He can destroy civilizations and end peoples. The worst evils of all human existence have come from those who worship their own intellect. The ideological movements that ended the lives of millions, the fanatic reigns of terror, like those under Robespierre, the brutal despotic tyrants who wielded famine, turned neighbor against neighbor, relative against relative, destroyed lives and sent thousands off to hopeless wars. Those are the ones arrogant and blind enough to worship the creations of their own minds, to be so convinced that they are right, that no moral consideration can come before it. The intellect is the Luciferian object of desire. It is Promethean fire, if used carefully and subordinated to a higher moral good. It can be used for great ends, but worship intellect itself, unbridled by any other moral considerations, and man can convince himself that anything is justified. And so, as the revolutionaries set up the state religion, the cult of reason, the French revolutionaries had gone to the worst place humanity can go. They had destroyed the old institutions, the old bonds, the old relationships and understandings of their society. They had wrought horror and terror in a spiral to demonstrate ideological purity. And now, they were worshipping intellect itself. Many cultures around the world have similar stories for this. The Japanese have the story of the fallen philosophers. Hindus the story of the demon Ravana. The Islamic telling of the story tells of the fall of Iblis. The legend of Faust tells this story, and we see similar notions in the mythology of Prometheus. While many more modern associations of Satan see him simply as dark and evil, much earlier Christian writers associated him specifically with the folly of being blinded by one's own intellect. And so the cult of reason, the worship of reason and intellect, this is not a new failing. This has appeared again and again throughout history, and every time civilizations find a way to warn the future about it. And yet, within liberal philosophy, there is a particularly high risk of falling into that trap. Eventually, France would begin to establish a new government for itself and limp back towards something functional. Yet France would be riddled with financial problems. Its government, the Directory, would be extremely corrupt and very poor at governing. Ultimately, a young military officer and brother of a prominent government official would step forward in a coup to reorganize the French Republic under a new system. This would be Napoleon Bonaparte, and he would become first consul of France. There's a curious tendency for bureaucracy in liberalism, a tendency much more pronounced in French liberalism. It's a quite middle-class belief set, and tends to be favorable for those like lawyers, civil servants, and white-collar professionals. In order to justify itself, a liberal system must claim that it's bringing liberty and/or equality, and as this must be done according to the general will, what emerges is a social structure based on rule sets, administrative bureaucrats, the true rulers of the system. As more inequality is witnessed within the system, larger bureaucratic entities must be constructed in order to equalize it. More of the population become enfranchised with voting. The story demands that more and more become represented, working in the direction of the liberal end state. And so, as these government systems become larger, more bureaucrats must fill those roles. Those bureaucracies must justify themselves, seeking out problems to create solutions. Yet, if any true solutions were ever found, there would no longer be a purpose for the bureaucrat. And as with any entity, its goal is survival. The state seeks to bring about more and more equality. Along with this come more and more bureaucrats. More and more of the population become part of the government. Within the story of the society, the government becomes synonymous with liberalism. More liberalism, more government. more government for more liberalism, creating new bureaucrats for the bureaucratic state. Despite being a great, powerful individual, one of the great men of history, even the Emperor Napoleon had a very large bureaucracy. As France clashed across Europe, the Napoleonic Wars were to great extent the first war of spreading liberalism. Napoleonic law was spread around the West. As Napoleon's armies advanced, he would bring along with him French liberalism. And though Napoleon would ultimately face defeat, the effects of this spreading of French liberal philosophy would leave an indelible mark across Europe. The philosophical change could not be undone. The first decades of the 19th century would see very new social systems arise across the continent and in Britain. Britain would experience rapid financialization, taking on enormous debts, and imbuing the Bank of England with much new power. In order to finance the Napoleonic Wars, Britain needed to borrow. In large part, Britain's success during the wars can be attributed to their financial capacity. They could simply borrow more than the French could. This was possible because of the Bank of England. Though the French had their own Bank of France and very large banker networks throughout Europe, networks like those of Jacques Necker, the Bank of England was something special. It had a unique capacity to create money, running a system of secular debt and taxes, and so Britain went deep into debt. As a result, during the first decades of the 19th century, the power of Britain's financiers rose. They would become, quite clearly, the most powerful class in the country. Figures like Nathan Meyer Rothschild would make up the new imperial ruling class. Here we get to another very interesting element of liberal phenomena, the link between liberalism and financialization. The financial classes of modern Europe have always existed quite symbiotically with liberalism. Liberalism justifies the financial class. Under the old system, where the leaders of a nation were its landed nobility, a class who came from a warrior elite, the financial classes of Europe needed to justify themselves with other means. The old nobility was receding. Families that had stood for centuries were finding themselves bankrupt, wiped out in wars, or otherwise destroyed by or subsumed into the rising merchant banker class. And liberalism perfectly told a story for this class. Think about what a system of financialized capital is. It justifies itself with the story of free markets. It explains that it brings prosperity because of liberty, and that those who sit atop it do so as a result of merit which rewards those who bring prosperity. They raise everyone up, and they get to sit atop the financial institutions, the institutions of the free market which makes life better for everyone. Now there is some truth to this, but it's also story. There was an enormous boom in prosperity during this century, but at the same time, there were new enslavements. The liberal story could tell of free markets, where people could rise based on their own merits, but at the same time, more and more became bound by debt in novel ways. If one has the power over the creation of money, and the others don't, then he who has the power to create money has the power to dominate over others via debt. That debt allows him to remain on top, allows his class to remain on top, all while being able to tell the story of a free, liberal market. Now, this isn't intended to tell the story that free markets are bad. After all, this is on an investment channel. But it is worth considering that very often people become attached to the stories of their systems. An attack against the system is an attack against the story. But sometimes the story isn't the same as the real world. And so yes, there was new freedom. There was remarkable innovation and prosperity. But there were also untruths in the story. The true nature of debt never told to the public. And so embedded within the liberal story was the right to rule justification for this new ruling class. A class which brought along with it great wealth, yet also new ways of control, new hidden shackles. As the 19th century went on, this new intellectual landscape and the sheer resource availability of the European empires led to a rapid boom in industry. Industrialization brings along with it some very sizable psychological shifts in a population. In the pre-industrial world, people were bound to their towns, their families, their land. There was a natural order to life, and there was a smaller scale. Imagine waking up with the sun, going to work on the farm. Your life changes with the seasons. Your world is circumscribed by very few who live around you. What you depend on is immediate. You eat because you pick crops. You stay warm because you shear wool. You rely on your neighbors and your neighbors rely on you. But in industry, your life revolves around the factory bell. You only make one little component of something. Very often, you never even interact with your finished product. You're a cog in a machine. The seasons begin to mean less and less. Suddenly, you're one tiny part in something much larger. You make the same thing over and over, working with many tens, many hundreds, even many thousands, all working alongside you, all feeding a machine that never sleeps. Your food no longer ends up on your table, but your component ends up in a product loaded onto ships and sailed around the world. Your whole world becomes something very different. The scale changes, the rhythms change, and so, as Napoleonic philosophy was spread across the continent, as European empires made the world a smaller place, and as people lost that connection to their villages and their fields, lost the connection to the immediacy of making something with one's own hands and sustaining himself and his family with it, the ground was set for a seismic shift. As Europe was leaving the end of its first great wave of industrialization, the old social relationships just no longer made sense in their present context. Beginning on February 22nd, 1848, protests would erupt in Paris. France was once again being plunged into turmoil, with large demonstrations against Louis Philippe, the reigning French king from the House of Bourbon-Orleans. Facing internal chaos, Louis Philippe would abdicate, bringing about the start of the Second French Republic. Along with this, universal male suffrage would be instantiated. In April of that year, elections would be held, with the results favoring moderates. After the crisis of revolution and the warfare of Napoleon, France still hadn't truly integrated its liberal philosophy. It didn't quite know how it would be the new thing it was becoming. In June, there would be an uprising of workers. As the working conditions of the lower classes were changing in industrialized France, the old social arrangements were no longer satisfactory. The government was unsure what to do. The French government at this point was being pulled in different directions. On the one hand, it wanted to be liberal, and on the other, it wanted order. Yet one pattern that will be repeatedly seen is that when a liberal institution is facing true opposition, it always chooses to squish the opposition, even at the expense of its professed ideals. Particularly as liberal systems become more bureaucratic, with fewer and fewer people actually accountable for consequences, these faceless entities find it very easy to move against opposition. Liberal systems justify themselves, and so, brutally putting down opposition, actually, so it's reasoned, is the liberal thing to do. The workers of the June revolts would be brutally repressed, with thousands killed. In December, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte would become president of the Second French Republic, and only a few years later, he would become part of a coup, instantiating Emperor Napoleon III as the monarch of France. Across Europe, there would be uprisings, revolts, and chaos. The lower classes simply could not tolerate old arrangements in these industrial systems, and the liberal philosophy that had been brought across the continent with Napoleon put new ideas in the minds of people that could not be undone. The middle classes sought new powers and status, and in 1848, Europe would be plunged into chaos. On January 12, 1848, there would be an uprising in Sicily against Naples. In March, uprisings in Vienna would force the Austrian Chancellor, Prince Metternich, to flee. There were crises arising across the German world. As a result, Prussia would grant a new constitution, and reforms would be seen across the German states. The parliament in Frankfurt would even meet to discuss German unification. Across the Italian states it would be much the same. There would be uprisings in Milan, Venice, and many other states, all uprising against Austrian rule. Some Italian states would see sufficient success that they would declare republics. The King of Sardinia would lead a war of independence, while on Austria's other side, Hungary would demand autonomy, and serfdom would be abolished across parts of the empire. Yet by mid-1848, Austrian and Prussian forces would begin to crush the uprisings. Meanwhile, the Frankfurt Parliament would fail. Across Europe, nearly everyone was either experiencing a revolt or was somehow involved in one. There would be revolts in Schleswig against Denmark. There would be uprising in Habsburg Czech and Galician territory. And meanwhile, across the Channel, unrest would rise in Ireland as a new wave of separatism was rising. As order would eventually be restored, these movements of separatism, republicanism, and general liberal unrest would not be in vain. New constitutions would be adopted, new relationships would be formed within empires, serfdom would be abolished in some places, and in many parts of Europe, debts would be forgiven. These revolts were beginning to break open new waves of republican and democratic sentiment. The monarchies of Europe were becoming nervous, and it was becoming clear that the liberal nation-state was going to be the dominant social form in industrialized Europe. Liberalism was breaking through in a new way, and it had found itself linked with industrialization. Many of the lower classes wanted more representation, and yet a curious dichotomy was beginning to emerge. As democratic ideals were emerging, the very nature of what democratic is wasn't entirely clear. It meant different things to different people. Think of the world today. What does democracy mean? What does our democracy mean? Does it mean the rulership of the people? Is it some sort of populism where everyone has equal say? Is it a populism where everyone's interests are represented? Are these the same thing? Or does it mean meritocracy? This goes back to that question of the liberal ruling class. What justifies the elite in the system? Many told the story that everyone was free to have an opportunity, that everyone had a chance to make it to the top, and so those who were the best would rise. This is the meritocratic position of democracy. Everyone has an opportunity, and as the best rise to the top, the best become the defenders of democracy. Therefore, the true democratic ideal is subordination to the meritocratic elite. In these large state systems, that would mean the bureaucrats. Over time, that would come to mean the academics, and it would mean the financiers. Our democracy is subservience to the elite, for as the right to rule story tells that the liberal elite bring along with them liberty and prosperity. The liberal project is thereby fulfilled when society does what the elite say, and as everyone in society is free to rise to the top, where the elite exist on merit, this elite are formed liberally. They rule liberally, and democracy is doing what they say. Yet this is fundamentally at odds with the more populist view, where democracy means the will or the representation of the people, where a democracy is not blind subservience to the elite, but is instead where everyone, including all the little people, have equal say and run the system, where the interests of even the lower classes are represented. And so, particularly going into the 20th century, democracy came to mean two very different things, two diametrically opposed things. One, the dominance of the liberal elite, meritocracy, the basis for the right to rule story. And to others, it meant the representation of the lower classes. It meant the little people having a voice. This is a fundamental disagreement that exists today. So many, particularly in the lower classes, believe that democracy means a sort of populism, that the little people should have a say and their interests represented. We see this way of thinking emerging across the West. And at the same time, there's the other way of thinking, our democracy, one that believes that the elite rose on merit, and that true liberal democracy is when society does as they say. This fundamental disagreement is made quite tricky when they both try to use the same word, democracy. It seems like democracy should be something that's straightforward, a word that everyone knows the meaning of. Yet when different people hear the word, they think of radically different things. It's as if it isn't even the same word. And so, as we leave off, going into the latter decades of the 19th century, vast liberal empires would sprawl across the planet. Industrialization would boom, seeing rapid social and psychological changes, and an explosion in wealth for the financial and merchant elite. The United States would begin to rise under its own economic model. Monarchs and noblemen would become afraid. New philosophical ideas would begin to emerge, and society began to yearn for what life was before, when there was magic in the world, when there was something romantic in existence, and where people felt like they were a part of somewhere, where people knew where they belonged, and they weren't just a cog in a big machine. The latter 19th century would see great excitement, incredible innovation, and an explosion of wealth. But at the same time, new turmoil would emerge, and as the British Empire began to reach its peak and Britannia ruled the waves, liberal imperialism would be spread across the world. And amidst all the excitement and terror, the old world of kings and queens, great estates and courtly ritual, of Baroque ballrooms and harpsichords, gentlemen's duels, and mighty sailing ships would begin to count down its final days.